expert worlds, onto representing knowledge in scripts and frames, and had finally foundered on the common sense knowledge problem. Knowledge that is so intuitive, we're hardly aware of it.
Common sense knowledge is the knowledge that everybody shares. Everyone knows that if you hold something and release your grip, it falls. They don't know about gravity, but they know that this is common sense. There's no person that you can communicate with who doesn't know the same things you do about space and time and social relations and geometry and language and whatnot. How large is this database that we all share? I suspect it's about 10 million items or units, whatever units are.
The secret of intelligence was common sense knowledge, the enormous number of things which we all know to be true, so much so that we're able to communicate effectively without even mentioning them. Could such vast quantities of knowledge possibly be given to machines? We learn these millions of things as children growing up. Could machines learn like people? Scientists had long been interested in machine learning, but computers made very bad students because they started out from such a low level.
Learning has the property that we learn at the fringe of what we already know. We learn that this new thing is similar to something we know already, and here's the difference. So the more you know, the more and more quickly you can learn. But the trouble is that we start our learning programs off with next to nothing, so they don't have a very big fringe, so they can't really learn very much very quickly.
Doug Leonard didn't think it was hopeless, however. He believed the way forward was painstakingly to feed the computer the millions of things it needed to know to understand language. Only then would it be able to learn by itself. In 1984, he set up a project in Texas to do just this. Because it was likened to a vast encyclopedia project, it became known as Psych. But the task was to input the kind of knowledge which is not in encyclopedias, because it's too obvious to include. For example, Psych would have to know some things no encyclopedia would dream of mentioning about Abraham Lincoln. The Psych project was the ultimate test of AI. If it was possible to build an artificial mind, this apparently was one way to do it. But critics said Leonard's ambitious 10-year project would never work because knowledge alone was not enough. Real common sense depended on having something no computer possessed: a human body.
Common sense knowledge, to a large extent, doesn't consist of facts. Not 100,000, that's sure, but not 1,000,000 either. No number of facts. A lot of what we know is not factual knowledge at all. It's skills. Anybody who had children must be struck by the number of years they can spend playing around with blocks, playing around with sand, even just playing around with water, just splashing it around, sopping it up, pouring it, splashing it, seems endlessly fascinating to children. And one might wonder, what are they doing? Why aren't they getting bored? How does this have any value? Well, I would say they're acquiring the 50,000 water slushing cases that they need for pouring and drinking and spilling and carrying water. And they've got their 50,000 cases of how solids bump in, scrape, stack on, fall off. And common sense knowledge would, in this story, that I believe, consist in this huge number of special cases which aren't remembered as a bunch of cases, but which have tuned the neurons so that when something similar to one of these cases comes in, an appropriate action or expectation comes out, and that's what underlies common sense knowledge.
Most people, it's true, acquire their common sense knowledge growing up as children experiencing life in all its richness through the senses. But is this the only way to get it? There are people who never experience much of the world at all, and yet acquire and use language with common sense. In Oliver Sacks's collection of strange neurological cases, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, he wrote of a patient, Madeline, born blind and unable to move her limbs. Practically everything she knew about the world was told to her or read to her, and yet Sacks records she could use language with common sense.
All my reading has been done for me. I can't read Braille, not a single word. I can't do anything with my hands. They're completely useless.
If Madeline succeeded where computers have so far failed, it was not because she experienced what the words meant, but because her limited experience was processed with an organ far more complex than any computer, her brain.
The pioneers of AI had argued that they didn't need to know the way the brain worked any more than the first aviators needed to build planes with flapping wings. Some critics had never accepted this analogy, arguing that when it came to thinking, the only way to do it was nature's way. To build an artificial mind, you had first to build an artificial brain. The human brain is not like a computer. It is billions of neurons connected together in thousands of ways. Experiences which come in through the senses trigger electrical signals to pass between the neurons. Patterns and regularities perceived by the senses are thus remembered as similar patterns of neural discharges. The brain is awesomely complex. But from the early 1950s, some scientists pursued the idea of building an artificial brain to try to imitate how the brain's network of neurons learned. In the brain, experiences are recorded as the strength of the connections between neurons. A new experience coming in through the senses changes the strengths of the connections. This pattern is then subsequently remembered. Other experiences set up other patterns. In the 1950s and 60s, scientists built a few working perceptrons, as these artificial brains were called.
He's using it to explore the mysterious problem of how the brain learns.
This perceptron is being trained to recognize the difference between males and females. It is something that all of us can do easily, but few of us can explain how. To get a computer to do this would involve working out many complex rules about faces and writing a computer program. But this perceptron was simply given lots and lots of examples, including some with unusual hairstyles.
But when it comes to a beetle, the computer looks at facial features and hair outline and takes longer to learn what it's told by Dr. Taylor. Andrew Cruikshank's wig also causes a little heart-searching.
After training, it's given new faces it has never seen. It successfully distinguishes male from female. It has learned. While promising, this approach to machine intelligence virtually died out. But in the late 70s, as AI's problems seemed insurmountable, it underwent a revival. The modern perceptrons are called neural networks, and the people who build them a growing movement called connectionists. Neural networks model the brain, not the mind. They're small learning machines. And at universities all over the world, connectionists are trying to find out how much their networks can learn. This vehicle is being driven by a neural network. The network hasn't been programmed. It has learned, by observing a human driver, how to keep the vehicle on the road.
Okay, here comes a shadow. This should be interesting. See how it deals with this. Seems to be doing okay.
Looking good, Dean.
Yeah, things are going well. I'm going to speed it up a little more.
While neural networks are superficially appealing, the small tasks which nets can so far conquer are a far cry from common sense. NavLab has to be retrained if it rains. And they have a problem which conventional software doesn't. Researchers don't as yet know how nets learn. Sometimes what a net is learning is very different from what the researchers think it's learning. Early neural networks contained some big surprises.
They took a lot of pictures of tanks more or less hidden behind trees and trees without any tanks behind them. And they trained a connectionist net to distinguish very clearly between the set of pictures where there were tanks and the set of pictures where there weren't tanks. And it worked wonderfully. But they wanted to know, of course, whether it could do new ones that it hadn't seen before. Well, first they gave it further ones that they hadn't shown it from the set of tanks, and it got them. And further ones from the set of trees without tanks, and it got them. But then just to make sure, they went out and took some more pictures and gave them to the connectionist net, and it failed completely. And then the solution turns out to be that all the pictures with tanks in them were taken on a sunny day, and the picture without tanks were taken on a cloudy day. And what the net had learned to discriminate was cloudy, how forests look in cloudy and sunny days. Now, no human being seeing big tanks behind some trees and not behind others would find that the similarity between the scenes was whether it was cloudy or sunny. Because the way we're tuned, I mean, the similarities go with whether the tanks are there or not. But nets, any old thing counts as similar.
My cat is in love with a rat. My dog
The prospect for tiny neural networks to capture something as elaborate as common sense is a very long-term one, as connectionists are the first to admit. The nearest they've got to speech is to get a network to learn to associate patterns of letters with their sounds when read aloud.
will not sleep. There is a way to end this day. I will run to...
The network was called NetTalk.
You're going to hear first what the network sounds like at the very beginning of the training. And it won't sound like words, but it'll sound like attempts that will get better and better with time.
The
network reads the letters, say the phrase grandmother's house, and makes a random attempt at pronouncing it.
Grandmother's house.
To teach the net the error of its ways, the phonetic difference between each guess and the right pronunciation
Grandmother's house.
is then sent back through the network, adjusting the strength of the connections, and the network's ready to try again.
And finally, after letting it train overnight, the next morning, it sounds like this.
Grandmother's house. I like to go to my grandmother's house. Well, because she gives us candy. Well, we eat there sometimes.
NetTalk understands nothing about the language. It's simply associating letters with sounds. But at least connectionists have made a start, getting neural networks to imitate some of the many things human brains do in recognizing patterns and navigating the world. Today's neural networks are very small, and they only do small things. But attempts to make networks bigger than a few hundred neurons backfire. The training time explodes. The brain, with its 10 billion neurons, has somehow managed to solve the problem. And the way it solved it is instructive. It is not one big general-purpose machine, but a collection of many special-purpose machines. In the normal brain, the machines for language, vision, movement, and so on are beautifully coordinated. Somehow, the brain has managed this task of integration, and from this integration emerges our general-purpose intelligence and common sense. We might have to understand how nature builds and coordinates her many micro-machines before we can build an artificial brain.
So far, AI is mostly a history of fascinating failures. But there is a rich legacy of practical, specialized applications which bear its name. It's produced programs which play chess as well as all but the very best players. It has produced expert systems which can do some of the things people dreamed about, though in restricted domains.
United Airlines Flight 3 leaves New York.
Rudimentary robots which carry trays round hospitals are starting to appear. There are computers which can read books to the blind.
The signed statement can be provided by a legally qualified physician showing them.
And can even translate limited amounts of Japanese into English.
I have a sharp pain in my abdomen.
But while these practical applications have appropriated the name artificial intelligence, they have little to do with the original quest for a general-purpose intelligence based on common sense. None of them could possibly pass the test Alan Turing had proposed in 1950, and which he expected would be passed by the end of the century. None of them could use language so well they could convince us they were human. But the quest has not yet been abandoned. The project Doug Lenert began in 1984, the Psyche project, is still going strong, and Lenert thinks he has a good chance of success.
You can think of this as mankind's first foray into large-scale knowledge engineering. I originally put the chance of this project succeeding when we started at about 10%. I think even that was a little bit optimistic. I now put the chances at about 2/3, over 60%. And the reason why I'm a lot more optimistic now has to do with the ways in which we have overcome the various tar pits, the potential thorns that might have snagged us along the way. There are all sorts of topics that we've had to deal with: time, space, causality, belief, emotions, rationality. And each one of them has had a whole community of researchers dedicating their life to formalizing, to studying, to codifying.
Lenert and his team, who call themselves cyclists, were hard at work trying to capture the world piece by piece, aiming to build a mind which knows enough so that it can understand language and learn.
That's logical. So here is her house, and this is walking.
It's a profession type, and nurses are medical professionals.
Yep.
Building a mind is painstaking work. What comes to mind when you think of a nurse? Psyche's mind has to be filled with all of these details of what a nurse does, from taking temperatures to giving medicines.
Now, what about stress in a job?
Stress in a job.
I mean, nursing is very stressful.
Yeah. I guess this would
That would be
be
like high
attribute.
burnout rate.
Isn't that under high life criticality, high...
For Psyche to be able to understand stories about nurses, it must know about the pressures of the job and even the fact that most nurses are female. Psyche is an attempt to build a pure disembodied mind. But what does an entity with no body make of all the knowledge that it is fed of a world it has not directly experienced? At night, while the rest of the team are asleep in bed, Psyche looks for inconsistencies in its database and comes up with new generalizations. And it's clear that Psyche sees the world in a pretty novel way.
So in the morning we come in and see what inconsistencies it's found, and we also sometimes see what interesting new discoveries it's made. This is very interesting. I wonder if this is true. This one says that two countries that have pretty much the same mixture of religions are members of pretty much the same international organizations. So I'm going to put a question mark next to that one. Here's another funny skewing based on what happens to be in the knowledge base. This basically says that most people are prominent. And that's because most of the people that we put in, aside from ourselves working on the system, are famous people from history. This is actually another funny sort of misunderstanding, where it's been told about Fred while he was shaving in the morning. And it's reached a kind of subtle problem where, on the one hand, it's decided that Fred, while he's holding the razor in his hand, has some electrical parts. But on the other hand, it believes that people don't have, in general, electrical parts. So it's trying to ask something here like, is Fred still a person while he's shaving?
Listening to Psyche, one gets the feeling not of a developing child, but of an alien intelligence, which knows a lot, but has a bizarre view of the world. But what would Psyche have to achieve to convince skeptics like Dreyfus that it was really intelligent?
I would say if the Psyche project could understand stories of the sort that 4-year-old children could understand, I'd be very impressed. I would think it had succeeded in showing that a great deal of intelligence could be captured in a totally disembodied way.
Okay, great.
If it failed, then I think symbolic AI is finished. It's tottering already because there's only that project really that seems to offer any hope. AI is finished for as many hundreds of years as it takes before we understand this mysterious thing that our brain does and how it does it.
But if it succeeds, the potential may be breathtaking.
The Psyche bet even though it was a high-risk bet, is a high payoff bet. And if and when it succeeds, the payoff will be in the form of passing the Turing test, of general natural language understanding, of powering machine learning programs to go off and learn some things that are unknown to humanity at the present time. If you look at the psych system that we're describing as a kind of mental amplifier, as an intelligence amplifier, then I think you'll see that using it, you'll be able to do things in a few decades that today people can't dream of doing.
The Dream Machine continues next Thursday at 9:30. On Monday, we look at the controversial career of politician and High Court Judge Lionel Murphy and the impact of the events and allegations that surrounded his final years. Mr. Neil is entitled to be an agitator, our fascinating true Australian story, Monday night at 8:30. Coming up, ABC News Late Edition.
Unimagined possibilities for future work in space, Discovery and crew had, as one reporter wrote, turned the unprecedented into a job that was all in 8 days' work.
Commodore Truly, that we've done our part, and he has the satellite now.
Without spacesuit and without risk, we may one day work in space without ever leaving Earth. Robotic systems that mimic human motion with great precision conceivably could be guided from across town or across the solar system. Machines that follow our every movement, piloted by a human brain that no machine today can match. The most useful robots will be those with mobility and versatility. ODEX 1, like other prototypes, proves these goals are feasible. Radio signals to ODEX's self-contained computers allow it to adapt to a variety of environments. It can narrow to maneuver through tight spaces, lower its body to clear the door frame, then raise again to normal height. But scientists generally agree it will be a very long time before robots come close to moving as humans do. Natural walking is an amazing combination of sight, coordination, and balance. At Carnegie Mellon University, Mark Raybert has studied locomotion for 8 years. The work in his laboratory has a dual goal: to understand how living creatures move with grace and dexterity without losing balance, and to lay the foundations for building robots with similar agility and speed.
We decided to begin our studies of balance in walking and running by studying machines that only had one leg. So after all, a one-legged machine must balance in order to walk, especially if it has a small foot, while the problem of coordinating the behavior of a number of legs is completely avoided.
The machine, inspired by the bouncing movement of kangaroos and pogo sticks, is operated by a computer. A joystick specifies direction and speed. Raybert found that a surprisingly simple program can control balance by breaking the problem into 3 parts: height, speed, and upright posture. Even when pushed, the machine can synchronize the 3 elements to remain stable and in motion.
Robots provide us with machines that we can do very carefully controlled experiments on. We can manipulate the machines, we can design a machine for a particular experiment. On the other hand, they don't really perform very well compared to the biological systems we're interested in. And biological systems are just the opposite. They perform spectacularly. They do things that we would love to make our machines do, but they're very hard to study.
To advance his research beyond the phase of one-legged machines, Raybert is studying running and jumping in 4-legged animals.
2, 3. About 40. To some people, robotics is the business of making factories more productive. To me, robotics could be a new science that has to do with the interaction of perception and motion and control. And it's very exciting that it could be a science that links these things together.
Using a stop-action projector, one of Raybert's graduate students converts the film frame by frame into numbers a computer can understand. For each frame, there are 32 points to be electronically read by the computer.
Is this the last jump, or the height of the last jump?
We'll probably get an estimate of the height difference, or the height of the jump.
But I think it looks great. It's clear that what we need is in there. I think it's the common perception of lay people that robots are much more developed than they really are. Just because people are able to move, walk, and use their hands effortlessly, it's not the case that existing robots are very good at doing these sensing and control operations that people do without much thinking. 3, go.
The early months of work with their newly built four-legged machine was a series of seemingly endless frustrations.
Well, you were right, it didn't work. It's interesting. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Sure is weird. Okay, I fall asleep thinking about what I'm going to do the next day, and I wake up early and I get it in here right away. And I can't wait to fiddle with the machine or get to work in the lab or get the guys going or cooked up or whatever needs to get done. Then there's the other times when I don't have the courage to come in and face the machine because there's been 6 days in a row when we've tried to make it work and it's failed, and today is probably going to be another one. It's very hard to get me to do things around the house, like fix the screens or paint the walls, because I'm faced with a choice. I can do this thing that the guy in the next house is doing and the next guy in the next house is doing, or I can come in here and do something that's never been done before, and that's exciting. It's hard to concentrate on doing the simple things at home when you have an opportunity to do something new, really new. Ready? 1, 2, 3, go.
Finally, progress. A controlled run of 56 steps. Skeptics had said the one-legged hopper would never work. They were wrong. And now, the elegant simplicity of the earlier machine has made this one a working reality. Challenged by his surprising success, Raybert's next goal is to move from trotting to galloping.
3, go.
To improve the dexterity of robotic hands, MIT's Ken Salisbury has studied the basic mechanics of grasping and manipulating for 5 years.
The human hand is really an amazingly complex and amazingly subtle piece of engineering, in a sense. If you look at the amount of the human brain that's devoted to processing and controlling motion and information from the human hand, it's really a large proportion of our brain. And so it gives us some sense that to try and duplicate or the capabilities of a human hand is not a simple task. And that's why in working with this hand, we've had to use a fairly large computer with a large amount of memory and a large amount of computational capability. To coordinate the fingers, there's a lot of processing necessary to make them move smoothly, make them move with good sensitivity.
Each finger has 3 joints. Steel cables act as tendons. Driven by a series of motors, the entire system is under computer control. Salisbury found that 3 fingers were the minimum necessary to grasp an object, hold it securely, and manipulate it. Robot hands currently used in industry tend to be claw-like grippers that merely open and close in simple repetition. The advantages of Salisbury's hand are that it can be programmed to grasp objects of different sizes and weights, and it can sense and control how much force it exerts. Still in the research stage, the system is not yet widely available for industrial use, but the robot hand's range of motion is already much greater than even the human hands.
I think it's reasonable to assume that a robot hand someday will be much stronger and much faster in certain kinds of tasks than a human hand, in much the same way that jet planes can fly much faster than a bird. They're maybe not as dexterous or not as good at landing in certain ways, but you know, technology in certain areas can really push concepts